On certain New York mornings, when the fog sits low on the harbor and the city feels like it's holding its breath, you can almost believe the tallest buildings are listening. Listening for the kind of footsteps that don't rush. Listening for the kind of man who doesn't need a crowd to feel important. Carlo Gambino was that kind of man. Not the loud kind. Not the showy kind. If John Gotti was a bright neon sign, Carlo was the wiring behind the wall. Unseen, steady, and powerful precisely because most people forgot it was there. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't smile for cameras. He didn't need to. Carlo preferred something older and quieter, control that felt like calm. Long before anyone in America knew his name, Carlo was just a boy in Sicily, growing up in a place where families were close and futures were often decided by tradition, not dreams. The sun there hit the stone streets in a way that made everything look permanent, even though life could change quickly. People spoke with their hands, with their eyes, with their pauses. Carlo learned early that what you didn't say could matter more than what you did. When he came to the United States, he didn't arrive with a parade. He arrived the way many immigrants did, with hopes folded neatly into a suitcase and a quiet understanding that America rewarded the bold, but it punished the careless. The city he stepped into didn't look like the postcards. It smelled like coal smoke and wet pavement. It sounded like 1,000 languages arguing and laughing at once. And it moved so fast that if you blinked, it left you behind. Carlo didn't blink. He watched. He listened. He learned the new map of streets and alliances the way other men learned the alphabet. He wasn't drawn to attention. He was drawn to structure, who knew whom, who owed what, who trusted which voice at which table. He didn't just want a place in the city. He wanted a position in its hidden machinery. People who met Carlo in those early years often walked away with the same impression. Polite, reserved, almost forgettable. That was his advantage. Some men couldn't help showing their ambition. Carlo kept his ambition folded up inside him like a letter he planned to read later. It made him hard to measure, and in New York, being hard to measure is often safer than being impressive. He settled into life with the patience of someone who understood time could be a weapon. While others chased quick money and quick praise, Carlo put his energy into relationships. Family first, always, and then the wider circle of people who mattered. He understood the power of loyalty, but he also understood its cost. Loyalty wasn't something you demanded. It was something you cultivated, like a garden you planned to live off of later. And Carlo cultivated. The neighborhood world he moved through was full of men who wanted to be seen. They liked loud laughter, dramatic stories, the kind of presence that turned heads. Carlo liked the quieter rooms, a kitchen table, a back corner of a cafe, places where the lighting was soft and the conversation stayed low. He preferred settings where people spoke honestly because they felt safe, and where decisions were made without anyone needing to bang a fist on the table. He wasn't soft. He was simply controlled. As the years passed, Carlo's name began to appear more often in the kinds of conversations that mattered. Private ones where people didn't talk for fun. He became known as someone who could be trusted with delicate matters, the kind of matters that required patience instead of force. That patience became his signature. There is a special kind of intelligence in knowing when not to move. Carlo learned it early. When tensions rose, he didn't jump in first. He watched how others reacted. He studied who panicked, who bragged, who tried too hard to look strong. He understood that, in the long run, the men who survived weren't always the toughest. They were the most measured. And Carlo was measured the way a banker is measured, careful with risk, careful with language, careful with promises. He built a reputation for being the kind of man who didn't create chaos, but who could prevent it. People began to seek his counsel not because he demanded it, but because he made complicated situations feel manageable. His voice didn't rise. His face didn't reveal much. He had a way of making others do the emotional work while he stayed calm, collecting information like a man collecting keys. In the background, New York changed. The city expanded, grew richer in some places, harsher in others. People chased opportunities. New neighborhoods rose. Old ones shifted. And in that constant movement, Carlo held to a simple philosophy. Stability is power. He didn't care about being famous. He cared about being effective. At home, Carlo was deeply family-oriented, and that detail matters because it shaped the way he saw everything. He wasn't the kind of man who wanted a life full of noise. He wanted a life that held together. He valued privacy, routine, and respectability. Things that sound ordinary until you realize how hard they are to maintain in a world built on risk. He wore respectability like armor. He didn't need to convince the whole city of who he was, only the right people. And the right people, over time, began to recognize something. Carlo Gambino wasn't flashy, but he was always present. He wasn't loud, but he was always informed. He didn't rush, but he always seemed to arrive exactly when needed. That kind of presence starts to change a room, slowly at first, then all at once. One evening, in a place where the lights were low and the coffee was strong, Carlo sat with older men who had seen generations rise and fall. The conversation moved carefully, like everyone understood the walls had ears. Carlo listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was a short sentence. Practical, calm, and impossible to argue with. The room went quiet. Not awkward. Quiet, respectful quiet. An older man leaned back and watched Carlo for a long moment, then gave a small nod that said something without words. This one is different. Carlo didn't smile broadly. He didn't celebrate. He simply lowered his gaze briefly, as if acknowledging a fact rather than receiving praise. And that, in its own quiet way, told everyone at the table exactly what they needed to know. Carlo Gambino wasn't trying to win the night. He was trying to win the years. Carlo Gambino didn't climb the way most men climbed. He didn't make speeches. He didn't throw his weight around. He didn't walk into rooms and demand attention. If anything, he seemed to prefer the edges, the places where you could see everyone without being seen too clearly yourself. But while other men chased the spotlight, Carlo studied the wiring. He learned which switches mattered, which doors stayed locked, and which keys were worth holding. In those early New York years, power wasn't just about force. It was about organization, networks, patience. A man who could keep things steady in a city that never sat still. Carlo's gift was that he understood the difference between noise and influence. Noise draws eyes. Influence moves outcomes. So Carlo stayed quiet and let outcomes speak for him. He worked through connections that felt almost familial, introductions made through cousins, uncles, trusted friends. In his world, people didn't do business with strangers. They did business with someone who knew someone who could vouch for you. Carlo became the kind of person you could vouch for without worrying you'd regret it later. And that reputation spread in the slow, reliable way the best reputations always do, by consistency. He learned that every promise had a cost, so he didn't make promises casually. If he said yes, it meant something. If he said, "I'll take care of it," people believed him. Not because he was theatrical, but because he wasn't. Carlo wasn't the man who needed to prove he could do something. He was the man who made you feel foolish for doubting he already had. New York, meanwhile, was a noisy orchestra of ambition. Men with fast talk and faster tempers tried to make names for themselves. Some succeeded for a while. Then they vanished into the background, replaced by newer faces who thought they were smarter, tougher, luckier. Carlo watched these cycles with quiet interest, never rushing to join the stampede. He treated time like it belonged to him. That patience brought him closer to the inner machinery of power. He became involved in decisions that weren't made in public. He learned how disputes were softened before they became disasters. He learned how stability was maintained, not through constant confrontation, but through careful communication, relationships maintained like bridges. Carlo was, at heart, a builder of bridges. He understood that too much tension snaps relationships. Too much pride turns allies into rivals. A city can survive conflict, but a network cannot survive constant chaos. So when friction appeared between people, Carlo often stepped in, not with dramatic authority, but with calm direction. He had a way of making people feel like they were choosing peace on their own. "Let's not make it bigger than it is," he'd say softly, and somehow the room would relax. People would nod. The conflict would shrink. It wasn't magic. It was emotional control. Carlo understood that the most dangerous person in a tense room is the one who stays calm while everyone else gets loud. Calm becomes gravity. As the years passed, Carlo's circle widened. He didn't collect followers like trophies. He collected reliable people, men who could handle responsibility without turning it into drama. He valued discretion almost as much as loyalty. In his mind, loyalty without discretion was a liability. He kept his personal life carefully protected. While others talked too much, Carlo spoke just enough. While others flashed.
Wealth, Carlo preferred modest respectability.
He didn't want strangers to notice him. He wanted strangers to overlook him. There's a difference. And it worked. In neighborhoods where gossip could turn dangerous, Carlo's name wasn't shouted. It was mentioned quietly, usually by someone who knew what it meant. He built influence in a way that made it hard to trace. He didn't demand credit. In fact, he often avoided it. Credit draws attention, and attention invites trouble. Carlo was always thinking about trouble, not in a paranoid way, but in a practical way. Trouble was weather. You didn't scream at the sky when clouds arrived. You prepared. You adjusted your plans. You stayed indoors when you needed to. In the background, the larger world moved through turbulent decades. Changes in government, changes in policing, shifts in the economy, new technologies, new pressures. Each change affected the hidden networks of the city in subtle ways. Some men fought the changes. Carlo adapted to them. He had a gift for seeing which traditions were essential and which ones were just habits. That gift made him increasingly important. People sought his counsel not because he demanded it, but because they trusted his judgment. They saw that he didn't rush decisions. They saw that he didn't let ego drive outcomes. They saw that when he spoke, he was already thinking several steps ahead. One winter evening, in a room warmed by low lamps and quiet conversation, Carlo sat with men who carried serious influence. The talk turned toward the future, how to maintain stability, how to keep things from spilling into chaos, how to ensure the network survived the changing city. A louder man argued for bold moves. A tense man argued for retreat. The room grew heated in that slow, dangerous way, voices rising, pride sharpening. Carlo didn't interrupt. He waited until the noise peaked, until everyone had revealed their emotions, their fears, their agendas. Then he spoke softly enough that people leaned in. Boldness makes enemies, he said. Retreat makes weakness. We do neither. We stay steady. The room quieted. The words weren't flashy. They didn't flatter anyone. They simply made sense. And in that moment you could feel it, the subtle shift of gravity again. The sense that Carlo Gambino wasn't just part of the conversation. He was shaping it. Afterward, as people stood to leave, one man lingered and said quietly, "You've got the right way of thinking." Carlo's expression didn't change much. "It's the only way that lasts," he replied. That was Carlo in a sentence. Always thinking about what lasts. As he walked out into the cold night air, the city lights blinking in the distance like patient eyes, he wasn't thinking about applause. He wasn't thinking about being seen. He was thinking about structure, about how to keep things running smoothly while others chased excitement. Because Carlo Gambino didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to be untouchable in the simplest way possible, by being indispensable, steady, and hard to pin down. And in the years to come, that quiet approach would make him one of the most influential men in New York, precisely because most of the world wouldn't realize it until much later. If you want to understand Carlo Gambino, don't picture a man kicking in doors or making dramatic speeches. Picture a man in a modest suit, seated slightly off-center at a table, stirring his espresso as if nothing in the world could hurry him, while everyone else in the room quietly adjusts their breathing to match his pace. That was his real talent. Carlo didn't chase control. He set a tempo, and other people, without noticing, started moving to it. As the years rolled forward, New York's hidden world grew more crowded, more competitive. Ambition was everywhere, loud and impatient. Men wanted quicker wins, bigger reputations, louder proof that they mattered. But Carlo kept building something different, an influence that didn't need to shout, because it wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was trying to endure. He understood something most people learn too late. The city is full of opportunities, but it's also full of traps. The fastest path upward often has the weakest railing. Carlo chose the slower stairs. He learned who could be trusted with responsibility and who fell apart when pressure arrived. He watched who made promises too easily and who treated a promise like a vow. When he found the right people, he didn't flatter them with grand speeches. He gave them small responsibilities and watched what they did with them. People who performed well got a little more. People who craved applause didn't last long near him. He didn't like men who needed to be seen. He preferred men who could do work quietly and go home like nothing happened. Carlo's own home life stayed carefully protected. He valued privacy the way some men value wealth. He kept family close, routine stable, and his personal world as uninteresting to outsiders as possible. That was intentional. A man with no visible drama is harder to hook into a story. Carlo didn't want to be a story. He wanted to be the hand behind the curtain, unseen, steady, inevitable. But even a man like Carlo can't avoid the pressure of time. As the city evolved, the old rules were tested. New faces entered the scene. Technology changed how people communicated. Policing changed. Headlines moved faster. Everything sped up. Carlo responded by slowing down even more. Not out of stubbornness, but strategy. When the world is rushing, the calmest person in the room becomes the most dangerous. Because calm is where decisions can be made clearly. He began spending more time in quiet conversations where people didn't waste words. Kitchens, back rooms, long tables where coffee was always present and the tone stayed low. These weren't theatrical meetings. They were the kind of meetings where someone says, "We need stability," and everyone understands that stability is not an abstract concept, it's survival. Carlo became a stabilizer. When disputes bubbled up, he didn't fan the flames. He cooled them. He spoke to people privately, one by one, in the way a gardener pulls weeds before they spread. He didn't humiliate anyone. He didn't make enemies unnecessarily. He gave people a path to save face, and he understood how valuable that was. Men who feel embarrassed become unpredictable.
Carlo preferred predictability.
He also understood perception better than most. He knew that if too many people feared you, they might unite against you. But if people respected you, respected your fairness, your steadiness, they'd protect you because protecting you also protected the system they benefited from. So Carlo built a reputation for being measured, practical, not easily provoked. There's a particular kind of power in being the person who doesn't get emotional while everyone else does. Carlo used that. He let others argue. He let them reveal their pride and impatience. Then, when the room grew tired of its own noise, he offered a simple, grounded answer. Something that sounded like common sense but carried deeper control. People didn't always realize they were agreeing to his approach. They just felt relief at the clarity. In time, his influence hardened into something almost invisible, like a current beneath the surface. You couldn't point to it directly, but you could see what it did. Decisions fell into place, tension softened, chaos avoided. People who wanted to last learned to align with that current. And the men who didn't align, who insisted on being loud, reckless, dramatic, found themselves pushed to the edges of the room. Carlo's strength was not that he won every argument. It was that he made arguments less necessary. He preferred harmony not for sentimental reasons, but because harmony kept the machine running. One spring evening, when the air was mild and the city smelled faintly of rain, Carlo sat at a table with a few men, whose opinions mattered. The conversation had started light. Family, neighborhoods, the usual, and then gradually tightened into something serious. Someone mentioned pressure. Someone mentioned a new complication. Someone joked too loudly, and the laughter didn't quite land. Carlo listened, eyes calm, face unreadable. A younger man at the table leaned forward, eager, and began talking about making bold moves. The words came fast, full of confidence, full of heat. A few heads nodded, but others shifted uncomfortably. Carlo let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct him in front of everyone. When the younger man finally paused, expecting praise, Carlo set his cup down gently. Bold moves are for people who want attention, Carlo said, voice soft. We want stability. It wasn't an insult. It was a simple recalibration of reality. The younger man's confidence wavered. Not shattered, just adjusted. The room seemed to exhale. Another man tried to argue for a different path, something cautious to the point of shrinking. Carlo listened, then shook his head slightly. Too much caution makes people hungry, he said. Hungry people make mistakes. Then he added, almost like he was speaking to himself as much as anyone else. The answer is always the same. We stay steady. We stay quiet. We stay smart. The room fell into that respectful quiet again, the kind of quiet that signals agreement without applause. Later, as people stood to leave, one man lingered behind, looking at Carlo with a mix of admiration and curiosity. You don't ever get tired of this? The man asked softly. Carlo's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. I get tired of noise, he said. This isn't noise. He walked out into the night, where the city's lights stretched like a sea of distant stars. He moved without hurry, as if time followed him rather than chased him. Because Carlo Gambino wasn't trying to win a moment. He was building something that could outlast. Moments outlast trends, outlast tempers, outlast men who burned bright and vanished fast. And as New York kept spinning, loud and hungry and restless, Carlo continued doing what he did best. Staying so calm that the city, without realizing it, began to orbit around him. By the time Carlo reached the part of life where other men started getting impatient, where they wanted titles, recognition, proof, he had already learned a secret that made impatience look childish. You didn't need to be the loudest man in New York to shape New York. You just needed to be the man people turned to when the room got complicated. And the room was getting complicated. The city's hidden networks had grown larger, richer, and more crowded with ambition. That kind of growth always comes with friction. Too many strong personalities, too many competing ideas, too many men who confuse drama with strength. Carlo watched it all like a chess player watching people play checkers, patiently, quietly, and with a faint sadness that came from knowing how predictable pride can be. He didn't try to outshine anyone. He tried to outlast them. Carlo's days were filled with ordinary-looking movements. Meetings that resembled business, conversations that sounded like planning, a life that could be mistaken for modest respectability if you didn't know what to look for. That was the point. Carlo believed that attention was a tax. The more attention you paid, the more you paid later. So he paid as little as possible. He kept his voice low, his schedule steady, his manner almost gentle. He didn't swagger. He didn't perform. He let other men draw circles around themselves with ego while he stood quietly in the center, collecting what mattered. Information, trust, and the habit of people seeking his approval without noticing they were doing it. There were certain corners of New York where Carlo's influence felt almost natural, like it belonged there, places where business and relationships mixed so tightly you couldn't separate them cleanly. He understood that the city wasn't just streets and buildings. It was connections, supply chains, permissions, people who needed favors and people who could grant them. Carlo didn't need to talk about power because he understood where it lived. It lived in patience. It lived in consistency. It lived in knowing how to calm the room when the room started to heat up. Around him, personalities clashed. You could feel it in the air at gatherings, the way laughter sometimes arrived too late, the way smiles didn't always reach the eyes. Carlo didn't fan that tension. He treated it like a small fire in a kitchen. You don't scream, you don't panic, you smother it before it spreads. He did this so often that people began to depend on him without admitting it. They would start a conversation by talking about something simple: family, food, the weather, and then, without even noticing how they got there, they would ask, "What do you think we should do?" Carlo would tilt his head slightly, as if considering something obvious. Then he'd answer in a sentence that felt like it had been true for years. "We keep it steady." Steady became his brand. Not flashy, not dramatic, just steady. And in a world full of men chasing excitement, steadiness felt like safety. But safety is attractive, and attraction draws crowds, and crowds bring pressure. Then came a moment, One of those moments history remembers with a date, even though the people living it rarely feel the date at the time. A gathering upstate, meant to be private, became public in a way nobody wanted. It was the kind of event that made headlines not because it explained anything clearly, but because it confirmed what many suspected, that there was a world beneath the world, and it had meetings like any other world. Carlo watched how the city reacted. Panic, curiosity, political noise, law enforcement suddenly energized. Men who had once felt invisible now felt exposed. Some grew, reckless from fear. Others grew angry. Some talked too much, trying to control the narrative. Carlo did what he always did. He got quieter. While others scrambled, Carlo tightened his discipline. He reduced unnecessary gatherings. He trusted fewer voices. He reminded people, softly, firmly, that attention was poison. No noise, he told them. No showing off. Some men resisted. They were used to being admired in their own circles. Carlo didn't argue with them in public. He didn't humiliate them. He simply let time teach them. Time, Carlo believed, was the best teacher because it didn't care about anyone's pride. Behind the scenes, leadership dynamics shifted too. The old guard had its way of doing things, and the new pressures demanded something different. A leader who could keep the structure stable without inviting the spotlight. Carlo didn't announce himself as that leader. He didn't campaign. He didn't posture. He was simply the man who kept being consulted. He became the man whose opinion settled arguments. He became the man who could speak one quiet sentence and make a whole table reconsider the direction of its energy. And then, in the way these things often happen, without ceremony, without applause, Carlo found himself at the center of a larger responsibility. The city's hidden machinery needed someone who could keep it running smoothly under brighter scrutiny. Someone who could prevent chaos, not create it. Carlo was suited for that in a way that felt almost inevitable. The remarkable thing was how little his day-to-day appearance changed. He still moved with the same modest composure. He still seemed like a man who didn't need attention. He still preferred to be underestimated by strangers. If anything, he became even more careful about looking ordinary. He knew that the most dangerous time for a leader was when people outside the circle started feeling curious. Curiosity turns into questions. Questions turn into pressure. Pressure turns into mistakes. Carlo's whole life was designed to avoid mistakes. At home, he remained private, family-oriented, routine-driven. He valued the small order of domestic life the way he valued stability in the wider world. Dinner at a consistent time.
Familiar rituals.
Respectable habits. Not because he was pretending to be ordinary, but because he genuinely loved order. Carlo did not romanticize chaos. He did not find excitement charming. He found excitement expensive. And still, even a man like Carlo couldn't fully escape the tension of the era. The world was changing fast. New kinds of scrutiny, new methods of investigation, new political urgency. The city was full of men who wanted to be famous for catching famous men. Carlo understood that the best defense wasn't bravado. The best defense was to be boring. Not in his private rooms. There he was sharp, strategic, always thinking ahead, but in the public eye, he wanted to be forgettable. A man who didn't generate stories. A man who didn't create scenes. A man who could walk through a neighborhood without turning heads. So he built power like a shadow builds presence. Quietly, patiently, and always attached to something solid. He strengthened relationships with people who valued discipline. He encouraged calm voices over hot ones. He avoided risks that were purely emotional, risks taken for pride, for revenge, for ego. Carlo didn't like ego. Ego was a door left unlocked. When people asked him why he stayed so quiet, he answered with the simplest truth. Because loud people don't last. Somewhere in those years, a new understanding settled over his circle. Carlo Gambino wasn't just a participant. He was a stabilizing force. He was the man who made the whole structure feel less vulnerable at a time when vulnerability was everywhere. And as that understanding grew, his influence became something you could feel even when he wasn't in the room. People began making choices as if Carlo might hear about them later, because they assumed he would. They didn't want to disappoint him. They didn't want to create headaches. They wanted to stay in the calm current he had built. That's how you know someone has real power, when people behave differently even in his absence. Late one evening, Carlo sat alone with coffee, the city's distant noise muffled behind walls. He thought about the years ahead, not in dreamy terms, but practical ones. The goal was never to win a month. The goal was to keep the structure stable for decades. He set his cup down gently and looked out at the dim New York night, where lights blinked like patient eyes. The city had gotten louder, so Carlo would become quieter still, because the quieter he became, the harder he was to catch in any single story. And Carlo Gambino, more than anything, wanted to control the story by refusing to become one. By the mid-1950s, the hum of Carlo's quiet patience had turned into something more powerful than noise: respect. Every room he walked into seemed to slow down half a beat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change expression. Yet people leaned forward when he spoke, afraid they might miss something small that would later turn out to be important. He hadn't seized anything. He'd simply outlasted the men who couldn't stop proving themselves. When the city's balance of power shifted again after that disastrous meeting upstate, Carlo didn't scramble. He just kept showing up, calm, dependable, reasonable, until one day everyone realized that when decisions were made, they were made in his rhythm. New York's skyline was stretching higher every year, and so was its shadow. Old traditions had to fit inside a modern world that kept inventing new rules.
Carlo adapted.
He learned which officials were honest, which reporters could be trusted not to sensationalize, which businessmen still valued a handshake more than a headline. He turned discretion into a kind of science. You didn't hear about Carlo Gambino unless you were supposed to. He rarely left Staten Island or Brooklyn without reason. When he did, it was for something that mattered. He'd arrive quietly, usually in the same kind of dark, well-cut suit, and he'd sit a little back from the center of attention. People would start talking faster at first, then slower, matching his pace. Within 20 minutes, the conversation would have shape, direction, and purpose. When he finally said, "That's enough for tonight," it always was. Behind the politeness was iron discipline. He hated unnecessary flash.
No gold watches.
No parties that spilled into photographs. He told younger men, if you want to impress someone, go home early. They'd laugh, unsure if he was serious. But he was. He kept a small house, lived on schedule, walked for exercise every morning. To neighbors, he looked like any careful, aging immigrant who had done well for himself. They waved. He waved back. No one would guess that conversations begun in his living room would ripple quietly across the city's hidden economy. His home life grounded him. Family dinners were sacred. Sunday afternoons were for being human, not strategic. He believed a man who couldn't maintain peace in his own house had no right trying to control anything bigger. That philosophy shaped the way he ran everything. No shouting, no chaos, no wasted motion. The era of loud power was beginning. Television, magazines, cameras everywhere, and Carlo recognized the danger early. Attention, he told a trusted associate once, is a disease. It feels good until you can't live without it. So he vaccinated himself by staying dull on purpose. Let others chase glamour, he would chase longevity. When smaller storms hit the city's hidden circles, disputes, arrests, betrayals, Carlo didn't panic. He studied how people reacted. Some men fought wind with wind. Carlo built walls. He'd reorganize quietly, shifting responsibilities, calming tempers, offering quiet advice that sounded more like wisdom than command. His power grew precisely because he never looked like he was fighting for it. By the early 1960s, his influence reached further than even he admitted. If someone needed permission, they sought it. If someone needed peace, they asked him to broker it. And he did, always with that same calm that made everything feel inevitable. He preferred evenings on the porch, cigar smoke curling into the air, the distant city glittering across the water. Sometimes visitors joined him. They'd talk about small things: family, food, the weather. Beneath those conversations were bigger understandings, agreements that didn't need signing because everyone at the table already knew what they meant. Carlo measured success not by headlines but by quiet mornings. If the phone didn't ring with problems, it meant the system was working. He wasn't chasing empires. He was maintaining order. And in a world built on volatility, order was the rarest currency. When younger, brasher figures appeared, men who liked cars, attention, tailored swagger, Carlo observed them like a patient teacher watching restless students. He didn't lecture. He let the years teach them instead. The city always taught the same lesson. Glamour burns fast. Discipline lasts. Occasionally, people from outside his circle, journalists, officials, tried to label him. They wanted archetypes. Villain, mastermind, king. Carlo dismissed the language. Stories need heroes and villains, he once told a friend. But life just needs balance. That sentence stayed with those who heard it. It summed him up. Practical, unsentimental, focused on equilibrium rather than ego. As age crept in, his movements slowed but his clarity sharpened. He delegated carefully, never to the loudest or most ambitious but to the men who understood restraint. He built continuity the way architects build foundations, quietly with weight where it matters most. To outsiders he was a ghost in a suit. To insiders he was the calm in a world that thrived on storms. Offices, quiet restaurants where the staff recognized regulars and didn't stare. When he spoke, it was often about routine, about keeping schedules, keeping tempers low, keeping relationships smooth. He didn't tell people to be fearless. He told them to be disciplined. Discipline, he'd say, is what keeps you alive. The city's pressure, however, didn't just come from outside, came from within as well. The longer a structure exists, the more it attracts two kinds of people, builders and climbers. Builders care about stability. Climbers care about being seen climbing.
Carlo trusted builders.
The climbers made him tired. You could feel the difference in a room. A builder asked questions quietly. A climber spoke in declarations. A builder listened. Climber performed. Carlo watched these personalities with patient eyes, like a man sorting fruit, keeping what was solid, setting aside what bruised too easily. Now and then, Carlo would receive news of some younger figure doing something flashy, drawing attention, making bold gestures, acting like the city was impressed by volume. Carlo's response was never dramatic. He would simply pause, sip his coffee, and say something like, "That's not how you last." He said it the way you say the weather report. Not angry, just certain. Behind his calm demeanor was constant calculation. Carlo didn't obsess over danger, but he respected it. He kept his circle tight. He avoided unnecessary meetings. He reminded people not to talk on phones like phones were private. He told them to assume the world was listening, even when it wasn't, because assuming it wasn't listening was the fastest path to regret. And yet, for all his caution, his name still carried weight. People who wanted stability sought him out. People who wanted permission waited for his mood. People who wanted to avoid trouble tried to align with his approach, because the safest place in a storm is near someone who knows where the storm is coming from. Carlo became, in a strange way, a weatherman for chaos. At home, he stayed steady. That steadiness mattered more now, because outside the home the world was beginning to spin faster. His family life remained private, built on routine and respect. The house itself felt like a refuge from the city's endless appetite for attention. Carlo liked it that way. He believed a man should have one place where he didn't need to perform. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit quietly and think about what the city had become. He had arrived in America in a different era, when people carried their secrets in their pockets and left them there. Now secrets had a way of slipping out, into newspapers, into rumors, into conversations overheard by the wrong person. Carlo's answer to this wasn't fear. It was reduction. Fewer moving parts. Fewer unnecessary risks. Fewer people who knew too much. And more emphasis on calm. When people came to him with problems, he solved them the same way he always had, by lowering the temperature. He didn't reward anger. He didn't reward impatience. He didn't reward ego. He rewarded self-control. Men who wanted to rise under Carlo learned that the fastest way to impress him was to make a problem disappear without anyone outside the circle noticing it existed. That approach, however, created a new kind of tension. the tension of being the calmest person in a city that loved drama. The calmer Carlo remained, the more some people wanted to test him. Not because they hated him, but because they were restless, because they mistook steadiness for softness. Those were dangerous misunderstandings. Carlo didn't correct them loudly. He corrected them quietly, through results. Through the way decisions ended up falling where he wanted them to fall. Through the way disputes suddenly cooled after a short conversation with him. Through the way people who caused unnecessary noise found themselves, over time, pushed to the margins. No public humiliation. No big speeches. Just the subtle reality that the city had no patience for men who couldn't control themselves. Still, the era was changing in bigger ways too. Law enforcement methods improved. Public interest in organized crime grew. People started demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding stories. Carlo watched all of it and responded by becoming even harder to read. He stopped giving the world anything to hold on to. He wore the same kinds of suits. He kept the same modest routines. He avoided grand gestures. He didn't try to look powerful. He tried to look ordinary enough that people's attention slid right past him. And it worked, mostly. But even a man like Carlo knew that time changes everyone's luck. You can be disciplined, careful, quiet, and still find yourself in a world that grows more determined to shine light into every corner. One evening, as the city lights blinked across the water like restless stars, Carlo sat with a small group of trusted men and listened to them talk about the future. Their voices were lower than usual, their faces more serious. Someone said, "It's going to get tighter." Carlo didn't argue. He nodded once, slow and calm. "Yes," he said. "So we get smaller." The room went quiet, not because they didn't understand, because they did. They understood exactly what he meant. Fewer risks, fewer distractions, fewer people, fewer reasons for the world to look in their direction. A tighter circle, a quieter footprint. Carlo looked around at them and added, almost gently, "The men who survive aren't the ones who move fastest. They're the ones who move least, and still get where they want to go." After that, the meeting ended without drama. People stood, exchanged quiet goodbyes, and disappeared back into their lives as if nothing momentous had been decided. But something had been decided. Carlo Gambino wasn't preparing for a year. He was preparing for the next decade. And as the city's second sky pressed lower, made of attention and curiosity and pressure, Carlo became even quieter, even steadier, even more determined to remain the man people couldn't easily describe. Because once the world can describe you clearly, it can also aim at you clearly. And Carlo Gambino had spent his whole life making sure the world never got a clean shot. By the early 1970s, New York had started to feel like a room full of mirrors. Everywhere you turned, there was a reflection. Someone watching someone who was watching someone else. The city looked brighter on the surface, but underneath it had become more suspicious, more crowded with attention. People wanted explanations for everything now. They wanted villains and masterminds and neat storylines. They wanted names they could hold up to the light. Carlo Gambino built his entire life around being the opposite of that. He didn't want to be a name. He wanted to be a current. And currents don't pose for photographs. Carlo's power, by then, wasn't the kind you could see from the sidewalk. It was the kind you could feel in the way problems stayed small, in the way conflicts cooled before they boiled, in the way the city's hidden machinery kept turning even as the outside world grew louder. People around him sometimes forgot how much effort it took to keep things quiet because Carlo made quiet feel natural. That was the trick. He didn't look like a man running anything. He looked like a man who preferred modest routines. A tidy house, a steady schedule, a calm face. Even when age began to soften his steps, it didn't soften his mind. If anything, he sharpened with time. Older men sometimes become sentimental. Carlo became more disciplined. He started thinking less about expansion and more about continuity. Continuity was a complicated kind of love. It meant choosing people not because they were exciting, but because they were stable. It meant building a future that didn't depend on your own energy. It meant accepting that one day you wouldn't be the one holding the room's temperature steady and making sure someone else could. Carlo began quietly measuring the men around him with that in mind. Not who talked the best, not who looked the boldest, who stayed calm when everyone else got emotional, who understood that the real goal wasn't winning an argument, it was preventing the argument from becoming a headline, and who could keep their mouth shut when silence was the most expensive currency. He watched his inner circle like a gardener watches weather. He noticed who was restless, who was hungry for status, who seemed too attracted to the idea of being recognized. Carlo didn't hate ambition, he just distrusted the kind that needed applause. When a younger man bragged a little too loudly, Carlo wouldn't scold him. He would simply look at him for a moment, expression unreadable, and then ask a soft question that made the whole room pause. Why do you want people to notice you? It wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. Most men didn't have a good answer. Some nights, Carlo sat with a few trusted voices in small, ordinary settings. Places where the lighting was warm and the coffee never seemed to run out. They spoke about practical things. Staying quiet, staying steady, staying out of unnecessary trouble. But underneath those conversations was a larger theme. The future. Carlo didn't say succession the way a politician might. He didn't treat leadership like a stage. To him, leadership was more like maintenance, keeping the building sound so no one outside noticed it needed repair. So he began to set the pieces gently, quietly, without fanfare. He promoted calm men. He relied on disciplined men. He kept distance from men who loved drama, even when they were useful in the short term. Short term was the enemy. Carlo never trusted short term. Short term was where people made emotional decisions and regretted them later. One evening, a close associate, someone who had been around long enough to speak freely, asked him, "You ever think about how people will remember you?" Carlo's response was typical Carlo. Simple, almost dismissive. "I don't," he said. The associate smiled, not fully believing him. "Come on." Carlo stirred his coffee slowly. "If they remember me," he said, "it means something went wrong." That sentence sat in the air like smoke, quiet and heavy. It wasn't false modesty. Carlo genuinely believed that the best leader was the one the world couldn't easily point at. Visibility brought risk. Fame brought attention. Attention brought pressure. Pressure brought mistakes. Carlo had spent his life reducing mistakes. And yet, whether he wanted it or not, history has a way of remembering the men who shaped the room, even if they never stood at the center of it. By the mid-70s, Carlo's health began to change the rhythm of his days. Not in a dramatic way, just subtly, more rest, fewer outings, quieter evenings. He didn't advertise it. He didn't complain. He treated it the way he treated everything else. As a reality to adjust to, not a drama to announce. People around him noticed, though. They began speaking a little more carefully, as if the volume of their voices could somehow protect him. They watched him with the kind of attention people give to a lighthouse during rough weather. Carlo didn't let them hover. He continued to appear composed. He continued to make choices. He continued to guide the room without raising his voice. Even when he looked tired, his eyes remained sharp. He still asked short questions that revealed who had thought things through and who was winging it. He had no patience for winging it. At home, he leaned more deeply into routine, into family, into the quiet comforts he genuinely valued. Dinner conversations.
Familiar fases.
The warmth of a house that felt steady even when the outside world felt messy. If there was any softness in Carlo Gambino, it lived there, behind closed doors, in the parts of life he protected most. Fiercely, and outside those doors, the city kept changing. New personalities rose, new styles, new attitudes about visibility and reputation. The world was beginning to prefer the loud version of power, the showier one. Carlo watched that trend with a kind of quiet disappointment. Not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he understood what the spotlight did to people. It made them reckless. It made them hungry for performance. It made them forget the first rule. If you want to last, be forgettable. One late night, Carlo sat near a window, looking out at the distant skyline. New York shimmered across the water, restless and bright. He looked at it the way an old sailor looks at the sea, respecting its beauty, never trusting its moods. He thought about time, about the long road from Sicily to this city, about the choices that had kept him steady while others burned out, about the men who had come and gone, loud and fast. Carlo had never been loud. He had never been fast. He had been careful. And now, in the quiet hours when the city finally lowered its voice, he could feel the future arriving in soft steps. The future would belong to men who didn't fully understand his philosophy. Men who might mistake silence for weakness. Men who might not realize that his silence was what kept everything standing. Carlo exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a thought he didn't need to carry tonight. The porch lights of his world still glowed. The machine still turned. The room was still calm, but the season was changing, and Carlo Gambino, who had spent a lifetime staying just out of focus, sat quietly with the knowledge that even the calmest currents eventually passed their torch to someone else. The city didn't announce when Carlo Gambino's era began to tilt toward its final stretch. New York never announces those things. It just shifts, like a tide turning in the dark, until one day you look up and realize the water is moving in a new direction. For Carlo, the shift arrived as a series of small limitations. He tired a bit sooner. He preferred shorter meetings. He listened with the same sharp focus, but his body asked for more quiet. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't allow sympathy to become a kind of currency around him. Sympathy, like attention, could be dangerous. It made people nervous. Nervous people talk too much. So Carlo kept his illness private, or as private as a man in his position could. The people closest to him understood the message. Keep the system steady. Keep it quiet. Don't bring problems to him unless they truly mattered. And most importantly, don't let the wider world sense weakness, because weakness invites challenges the way a light invites moths. Carlo had spent his whole life minimizing unnecessary motion. Now he moved even less, and yet his influence remained everywhere. That's the strange thing about real power. When it's built properly, it doesn't vanish when the builder slows down. It becomes a habit in the people around it. It becomes the default way decisions are made. Men who spoke to Carlo during this period often left with the same feeling. He was tired, yes, but not diminished. His eyes still carried that calm certainty that could cool a room. His sentences were still short, practical, and unarguable. If anything, his approach became more distilled, less patience for noise, more insistence on discipline. He didn't want excitement. He wanted continuity. So he began to place even more emphasis on who would carry his philosophy forward. He had always believed leadership was less about charisma and more about temperament. You could teach a man procedures, you couldn't teach him restraint. You either had it or you didn't. Carlo looked for restraint the way a jeweler looks for flaws, closely, carefully, without rushing. He paid attention to who stayed calm under pressure, who didn't seek credit, who didn't stir trouble out of boredom, who understood that the best move is often doing nothing at all. And he noticed, too, the new trend that worried him, younger figures who thought being seen was the same as being powerful. Carlo didn't like that trend, not because he feared it for himself, but because he knew it would bring heat to everyone. The loud era was coming whether he wanted it or not. Television loved a character. Newspapers loved a face. People loved a story they could understand in one paragraph. Carlo's whole strategy was to be too complicated for one paragraph. In his quieter meetings, he began speaking more directly about discretion. He didn't preach. He simply stated facts the way you state gravity. Anything that brings attention, he said once, brings problems. Problems don't end. They multiply. He made the men around him repeat the message until it became part of their muscle memory. Fewer words, fewer gatherings, fewer risks, fewer chances for someone to misunderstand what they saw. And yet, Carlo understood a deeper truth. You can reduce risk, but you can't erase it. You can build walls, but time still wears them down. The outside world pressed closer with each passing year. Law enforcement methods improved, public curiosity grew, and the city's politics shifted toward wanting big wins, the kind that could be shown on television. Carlo watched this from behind his curtains, so to speak, and tightened his circle again. He became harder to reach, more selective, more protective of his time. Some men found this frustrating. They wanted the old access. They wanted to feel close to the center. Carlo didn't indulge them. The center, he seemed to tell them without words, is not a place you visit. It's a responsibility you earn. At home, his world remained remarkably steady. Family dinners, soft conversations, the quiet comfort of routine. Carlo cherished those moments, not because he was sentimental, but because he understood how rare peace is. In New York, peace is not given. It's maintained. He maintained it at home with the same discipline he used outside. Calm voice, clear boundaries, respect for routine. He rarely spoke about work in detail. He didn't want the outside world bleeding into the kitchen. He wanted the kitchen to stay a kitchen. But even in those calm domestic moments, the future hovered. Carlo could feel it. The system he had shaped would soon belong to others. Men with different styles, different appetites for attention. Men who might not fully appreciate how much his restraint had protected them. Carlo didn't fear death in a dramatic way. He treated mortality the way he treated risk, as something to plan around, not something to panic about. The planning, in his case, was not about wealth or monuments. It was about ensuring stability after he was gone. And so, quietly, he laid out his final guidance like a map drawn in pencil. Keep things calm. Avoid unnecessary conflicts. Never let pride write checks discipline can't cash. And above all, don't be tempted by the spotlight. One evening, late in this period, Carlo sat with a trusted associate in a small room lit by a warm lamp. The associate looked tired, worried, like a man who had seen too much of the city's coming noise. "Everything is changing," the associate said softly. Carlo nodded once, slow. "It always does. But it feels faster now."
Carlo S. Gase stayed steady.
"Then we move slower." The associate gave a faint laugh, not amused, more relieved. "You always say that." Carlo's mouth twitched into something that almost counted as a smile. "Because it's true." The associate hesitated, then asked the question people were afraid to ask directly. "And after?" Carlo didn't look away. "After," he said, "they'll either remember what kept us steady, or they'll learn it the hard way." The words were calm, but they carried weight. Not threat, not drama, just the quiet certainty of a man who had watched too many cycles to be surprised by the next one. Later, after the associate left, Carlo sat alone for a while and listened to the city in the distance. Even from Staten Island, you could feel New York's restless heartbeat. It never stopped. It only changed tempo. He looked out at the skyline, shimmering across the water, and thought about how strange it was that a boy from Sicily had become an invisible architect of this city's hidden order. He had never wanted applause. He had wanted steadiness. He had wanted control without performance. And for a long time, he had achieved it. But now, as the years turned and his health narrowed his world, he could sense the coming era, the louder era, waiting just beyond the edge of his control. Carlo exhaled slowly, as if releasing a thought he no longer needed to carry tonight. He rose with measured effort, turned off the lamp, and moved toward bed. Outside, the city's lights kept blinking, patient, restless, alive. Inside, Carlo Gambino's house remained calm and quiet, holding the last stretch of an era that had been built not on noise, but on discipline. The last years of Carlo Gambino's rule didn't feel like a dramatic finale. They felt like a candle burning lower, still steady, still warm, but clearly closer to the end of its wax than the beginning. And because Carlo had always hated drama, that suited him. He spent more time at home, more time in familiar rooms where the light was soft and the chairs didn't need introductions. His body asked for more rest, but his mind stayed sharp in the way certain minds do when they've spent decades training on patience. He didn't talk about his health the way other men might. He treated it like weather, something you respect, something you plan around, something you don't complain about because complaining doesn't change the sky. People around him adjusted their behavior without needing to be told. They brought fewer problems. They spoke more carefully. They tried, sometimes awkwardly, to keep their faces calm in his presence, as if their worry might insult him. Carlo noticed, of course. He always noticed. He didn't scold them for worrying, but he also didn't comfort them with speeches. Instead, he gave them the only comfort he trusted: structure, routine, clear decisions made with the same measured tone he'd used his whole life. A man like Carlo didn't say, "I'm preparing you." He simply prepared you. There was a reason people feared change in his world. Change didn't just mean new faces. It meant new temperaments, new appetites, new mistakes. Carlo had spent his life proving that discipline could keep a system steady even when the city outside it grew louder. The question hovering now was simple and terrifying. Would the next era value discipline the way Carlo did? He wasn't naive. He knew the answer might be no. In quiet conversations with trusted men, Carlo began to speak more openly about the one topic everyone danced around: the future. Not in sentimental terms, not in the language of legacy. In practical terms, he talked about stability the way an engineer talks about load-bearing beams. Everything, he'd say, depends on restraint. Restraint. That word was his true inheritance, more than any position or title. Carlo believed restraint was what separated lasting power from temporary chaos. It was what kept men from reacting emotionally, from chasing attention, from making the kind of mistakes that created headlines and consequences. The city itself seemed to be daring people to forget that lesson. Television made everything feel closer, faster, louder. Newspapers loved a face. Cameras loved a character. The world was tilting toward spectacle, and Carlo could feel it like a change in pressure before a storm. He responded by tightening the circle again. Fewer meetings, fewer voices, fewer opportunities for anyone to talk too much. The men who thrived under this approach were the ones who already shared his temperament. The men who struggled were the ones who needed movement, excitement, proof. Carlo had no patience for their restlessness. Restless men, he believed, were the easiest to provoke and the quickest to break. One evening, a trusted associate, someone who had seen enough years to speak honestly, sat with Carlo in a quiet room and asked, "Do you ever worry about what happens when you're not here to slow them down?" Carlo didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit there, like a cup of coffee cooling on the table. Then he said, almost softly, "If they forget restraint, the city will remind them." It wasn't a threat. It was a prediction. That's what made it heavier. Because Carlo understood New York like a living creature. He understood that the city punishes arrogance, punishes noise. It punishes men who believe they can outrun consequences forever. Carlo had survived not by outrunning consequences, but by refusing to invite them. Now, he could sense that the next era would be tempted to invite them anyway. Behind the scenes, people whispered about who would carry the responsibility forward. Carlo didn't encourage open debate. Debate created factions, factions created tension, and tension created noise. He preferred quiet transitions, the kind that looked inevitable in hindsight. So he set the direction with the same calm he used for everything. Quietly, firmly, and without theatrics. He favored a successor who matched his preference for low-key control and business-like steadiness. Someone who could appear respectable, someone who wouldn't chase the spotlight, someone who could keep the structure quiet. But Carlo also understood something else. Even the best choice can create friction if others feel overlooked. A system can be stable and still carry resentment like a hidden crack in a wall. Carlo didn't like cracks. He tried to seal them with careful gestures, private assurances, respectful roles, balanced responsibilities. He was smoothing the future the way he'd always smoothed problems, before they became visible. Still, the tension existed. Not explosive tension, Carlo didn't allow that, but the quiet kind. The kind you feel when a room is too polite, when people agree a little too quickly, when laughter arrives a beat late. Carlo could read those signals as easily as others read road signs. And yet, he remained calm. Carlo's calm in these years wasn't the fresh calm of a younger man with endless time. It was the calm of someone who had already done the hard work. Someone who knew the system would continue for a while on the momentum he had built, even if the next hands on the wheel didn't share his touch. At home, his routines became even more precious. He took comfort in small details. The same chair, the same quiet evening, the simple rhythm of family life. If the outside world was unpredictable, the inside world could still be arranged carefully. In the late hours, he sometimes sat near a window and looked out toward the distant glow of the city. New York shimmered across the water like a restless thought. Carlo watched it with neither romance nor fear, just familiarity. He remembered Sicily sometimes in those moments, not as nostalgia but as a reminder of where his instincts had been forged. The old lessons had followed him across the ocean. Speak less, watch more, never rush, never show your whole hand. Those lessons had carried him through decades in the loudest city in America. That alone felt like proof of something. Then, as the years narrowed, the world around him began to treat him with a different kind of respect. Not the eager respect of people trying to impress a strong leader, but the careful respect people give to an era they can feel ending. Men spoke of him in softer tones. They asked for his approval the way people ask for a blessing. Even those who didn't fully share his philosophy understood one thing. Carlo had kept things steady for a very long time, and steadiness in that world was rare. One night, after a quiet visit from a trusted man, Carlo sat alone and let the silence settle. The house was calm. The city was distant. The future was close. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look sentimental. He looked like Carlo Gambino. Measured, quiet, and fully aware that the loudest part of a story often begins after the quietest man leaves the room. Carlo Gambino's final days didn't come with drama, because drama was the one thing he never allowed to define him. He stayed close to home, close to routine, close to the quiet he had always treated as protection. The city outside kept roaring. New names, new noise, new appetites for attention. But Carlo remained what he'd always been. Measured, private, and careful. When he died in 1976, New York didn't stop moving. It never does. But inside the world he had quietly shaped, the air changed. People realized how much his steadiness had been holding things together. The calm he created didn't vanish overnight, but without him it became harder to maintain. In the years that followed, louder styles of power began to rise. More visibility, more swagger, more risk, and the city, as Carlo predicted, started teaching its old lesson again. Attention is expensive. And that's Carlo's story in the simplest bedtime truth. He didn't rule by being feared in public. He ruled by being calm in private, by moving so quietly that most people never noticed how much he moved at all, until the silence was gone and everyone finally understood what it had been worth.